Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Welcome to those who access the podcast through Apple Podcasts, Rumble, Spotify, and YouTube. Today we continue in our study of the book of Genesis. We're in chapter 40, verses 16 through 23, which reads, "When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." That's Genesis chapter 40, verses 16 through 23. Today we complete our study of Genesis chapter 40, where we find Joseph still in Pharaoh's prison with his 2 newfound friends, the butler and the baker of the Pharaoh. Both of these men had dreams on the same night, and Joseph accurately interpreted their dreams from their beginning to their end. Having considered the first dream, the dream of the butler today, we will consider the second dream, the dream of the baker. In verses 16 and 17 of today's passage, we read, "When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all the kinds of goods for the Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. In the dream of the baker there were 3 white baskets, which were filled with baked goods. The baskets were wicker, and so one would have been able to see the baked goods through them. The Jewish historian Josephus said there were loaves in 2 of the baskets, and in the 3rd there were other tasty baked goods. But the birds swooped down and ate the bread. What should have been for Pharaoh were eaten by the birds." In verses 18 through 22 of today's passage we read, "So Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them." As was the case with the dream of the butler, there was a 3-day fulfillment of the baker's dream. As we see so many times in the Bible, when 2 things are placed side by side, there is a contrast and yet there is a confirmation. This is no different. The confirmation is the 3 days. With over 400 occurrences of the number 3 in the Bible, a careful study reveals the number 3 is always associated with God. When God made man in his image, he made us with a body, a soul, and a spirit. On the Mount of Transfiguration, there were 3 people, Jesus, Elijah, and Moses. The body of the Lord Jesus was in the grave for 3 days. We could go on, but I think you get the idea. Then Pharaoh put the baker to death. Some say the baker's head was taken off by decapitation, and then his body was nailed to a tree. Some say he died either by hanging or crucifixion. The Jewish historian Josephus said he was crucified. However he died, he hung on a tree, and the birds ate his flesh 3 days later. We are forgiven of our sin because we have placed our trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. Or we are still in our sin, awaiting the judgment of God. We either have a curse upon us or we have the blessing of God upon us. These two dreams mentioned in today's chapter likewise contrast and confirm. They contrast the choice of every human on this earth. We will go with God, or we will try to make it on our own. For those who go with God, He grants them forgiveness. For those who try to make it on their own, there's eternal damnation awaiting. Only 2 birthday parties are mentioned in the Bible, Pharaoh's and Herod's. These birthdays are mentioned because these men were rulers and the celebration affected the outcome of the decisions they made. In the case of Pharaoh, it was the time to reassert his rule and reaffirm his nobles. His rule and authority was established through decisions he made concerning life and death, specifically that of his butler and his baker. And so he lifted up their heads. The meaning of this comes from the surrounding context. It means something like to hold a trial. Imagine a group of people entering into the presence of the king. They would have their heads down and their eyes averted from his as a sign of respect. To lift up one's head then would be to meet the gaze of the king. For those who were in the king's favor, they would be looked upon with approval. For those who were out of his favor, their meeting his eyes would be with a note of disapproval. His gaze would then be their sentence. Whatever made Pharaoh angry with the cupbearer, it was forgiven. He lifted up his head with a favorable gaze, and his status was restored. In acknowledgement of that, he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. In the Hebrew, it says, he set the cup upon Pharaoh's palm. The picture was of Pharaoh opened his hand, palm up, and the cupbearer gently placing it into his hand. Exactly as Joseph interpreted the dream, so it came to pass. Sadly, the chief baker went to his death, and the word used here for his hanging pictures for us crucifixion. In verse 23 of today's passage we read, "Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." The last verse for today's passage closes with the fact that the cupbearer didn't remember Joseph, even though Joseph helped him so. It was one thing to be forgotten by a human, but another to be forgotten by God. Obviously, the Lord had more work for Joseph to do in that prison, and this explains why the butler didn't do as he had promised. If the cupbearer had remembered Joseph right after he was restored to his position, then Pharaoh wouldn't have come to know Joseph in the way he needed to, and therefore wouldn't have ever promoted Joseph to the place God wanted Joseph to be promoted, as the second most important person in the world, as we will see. Thank the Lord that he knows the perfect time to bring such to fruition. Very often we find ourselves wanting God to act now, but patience is required. This is why we must trust Him and walk with Him daily, for He only knows the end from the beginning. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helping you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.